we start with each of you telling me what the cutting-edge therapies, in layman's terms, that you're most excited about?
Well, in the last session, you talked a bit about CRISPR, which, as you described, is rightly, I think, described as molecular scissor. One of the things that's evolved since that first reduction of it to practice, which, as Luke has said, was just about 12, 13 years ago, sort of relatively recent time frame. I'm particularly excited about some of the new versions of that tool that have come out that look more like a molecular pencil, or look more like a molecular word processor, where you can literally put a cursor somewhere and type in pieces of the genome, or you could add things in. So that's a continued evolution. And again, I think it speaks to the pace at which science is moving. The fact that we, not even 12 years ago, the field invented the idea of a molecular scissor, and now we have versions and permutations of it that allow us to expand what the potential of gene editing is. So that's just one of numbers of examples. I'll let Daniel talk about some other ones he's working on.
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing this for nearly 20 years now, and God gave us an amazing vehicle, our bodies. And I think if you look across the spectrum of disease, autoimmune disease, cancer, neurological disease, the things that I get excited by are the things that we're doing just to try and restore homeostasis. So if we think about autoimmune disease, building therapeutics that help the immune system recognize the difference between self and non-self. If we're thinking about our genome, not to use tech as an example too much, but really the genome is the code. And then we have RNA that uses that code to make proteins. And we have tools now that can regulate each level of that. Right? And so our job is to think about how we just push the pendulum back into a healthy pathway instead of a diseased pathway. And I think we have a lot of tools to do that today. And in the context of cancer, taking some of the learnings from the COVID RNA vaccines and being able to help our immune systems see cancer and kill it, I think is actually, for me, really, really exciting. And I think the other thing about it that's important and maybe a little bit different to the panelists beforehand is cost is really important. It's no good making a sickle cell cure that costs $3 million. This is useless. I mean, I hate to say it. It has to be affordable in regions of the world where these diseases are, mostly present. And RNA technology actually gives us that opportunity that we can get the cost of goods to the cost of a vaccine. Now we're talking about technologies that can be applied globally in regions where they're most needed.
I mean, that's a really interesting perspective, because a lot of people would say you start with an innovation, it costs a lot of money, and over time it's used by enough people that cost comes down.
Yeah, but I think that, I don't know that it's purely just about time. It is about additional technological innovation that recognizes how to take a tool from perhaps another field and apply it over here. So the example that Daniel just gave of thinking about what did we learn from the mRNA vaccines, and how do you take some of the fact that we've invested tons of money to try to figure out how to scale up and produce enough of those vaccines and take it into a completely new area. Think about how it could work in an area like cancer, or as Daniel just said, something like hemoglobinopathies. And I think we're at a point where there is so much technological innovation that I think it's about thinking about how to creatively apply it to different places so that you can make some of these breakthroughs. I completely agree with his view that it is both about, if you take the sickle cell example, it is partially about cost. It is also about the fact that the process today to be able to deliver a treatment for sickle cell involves taking cells out of a patient, modifying them somewhere in a clean enough lab, and then bringing them back to the patient, ablating their entire immune system, taking it out for a temporary period, and then giving them the treatment. That is an incredibly complex process to try to replicate around the globe. What if you could instead do that all inside the cell? You never take cells outside the patient. You actually modify them inside the patient, and you don't have to ablate their immune system. Those are technological possibilities that we'll start to see. So I think it isn't just about time, it's about the innovation that's happening through that time.
I mean, in these discussions, it's so exciting because we talk about these innovations that sound honestly like magical, like a real silver bullet. What is holding you both back? What would you, if I could give you, if I were a genie and I could command some wishes, what would you want?
I'm going to be really bold here, and it's just a function of capital. I truly believe in the context of cancer that within, a $500 million investment to some of the things that we're doing probably will get us to a place where we have, therapeutics that are approved in the next 5 years that really transform breast cancer, pancreatic cancer, liver cancer. I think that's really, really possible. And I think the other thing is, Jeff and I are fortunate we have science and business background. When you come at something from a business point of view, one of the things they teach you very early on in business school is if it costs too much to make and people can't afford it, it's probably not a good business model. And I think having that mindset and applying it to that is actually quite important.
Yeah, I think capital is certainly one answer. I think the other answer right now is that we have this sort of explosion of new science that's helping us, frankly, perturb the human biology in various ways to correct disease. So whether it's through RNA, whether it's through direct DNA editing or changing, whether it's modifying cells inside the body, modifying cells outside the body, we have a tremendous amount of tools. What I would say in the last 5 to 10 years that we have that I would love to see more of is more of a direct understanding of human biology. So a little bit less investment or focus on the tools itself, but sort of further elucidation. So when we talk about, and Tom mentioned this in the last panel, when people talk about artificial intelligence and its application in something like drug discovery, my biggest skepticism for that has to do with the fact that we have to generate an extraordinary amount of data about human biology in order to elucidate new things that we don't know today. There are things we don't understand yet. We have the tools to do something about it, but we don't know the thing to do yet, right? And so that would be the thing that I would love to have more of, which is sort of the raw data to be able to elucidate a much, much wider set of human disease because we have the tools to actually interfere.
So if we're going to talk about artificial intelligence, there's huge work being done by Google DeepMind with, predicting protein shapes, protein folding. How do you see AI influencing the work that you do?
It's still about, I can tell you today, I think that I am more skeptical about the application of artificial intelligence in designing drugs. There are certain types of drugs I think it could work for, but for many, many classes, I think it is early and too early because I think we don't yet have a sufficient amount of data to place the machine on top of to then go find us something. You got to have the data first. The reason why things like ChatGPT came out is because we had developed we basically placed the entirety of human language online. And so when you basically
wanted it or not.
Yeah, whether you wanted it there or not, whether you wanted your opinion or my opinion on there or not, it's all there. And so that's raw language data sitting there. And then you could put a machine on top of it and ask it to sort of come up with something novel from that. You need the data first. And so we still are in a much, much different stage in general in healthcare, in general in science, in terms of generating and having that data. However, if you go back to the natural language point and the human language point, there are huge aspects of developing drugs, not discovering drugs, but developing drugs, including manufacturing them, including ensuring and showing that you have produced the right quality of your product, that require language and documentation. When we submitted our first request for approval in the United States for the first ever gene therapy, it was a 60,000-page document. We had 25 people basically holed up in a room for 2 months writing the thing. There are huge opportunities to use the language capability of whether it's GPT or others, or ChatGPT or others, to make more efficient the development process. And there's a company I was talking to recently that has 80,000 standard operating procedures for manufacturing and overseeing quality control of a product. Again, every time anywhere in the world a regulator changes something, they have to go and review all those 80,000 pages, or 80,000 documents.
So you can see some efficiencies.
So there are real efficiencies in the development, and I think that could be helpful in the short term. I'm just more skeptical about discovery because we don't yet have essentially the same, we don't have the equivalent of the internet hanging out there of the entire human biology and how it relates to disease. We need to build that first. And there are obviously efforts, you mentioned some of them, but that's the first step.
I think it's kind of rare to find a skeptic on AI these days.
Well, I'm about to
You're going to add
take
to
the
it.
knees out from that. I'm going to use real life examples. So we have the world's first in vivo mRNA chimeric antigen receptor being applied across 2 different cancers. One targets TROP2, this is in breast cancer, prostate, pancreatic cancer, and the other one is in liver cancer. And that targets a protein called GPC3. Now, you would think if you build, these are very similar to the COVID vaccine in structure. You would think one would work really easy, you just plug and play it. The GPC3 product didn't work at all. We couldn't get it to express, there's a whole different reason. We built our own modeling using machine learning, and we figured it out. And from the day of drawing this on the whiteboard to the very first patient receiving the dose, and 50 days later having a 57% reduction in tumor burden was 8 months. So, I know Luke, who we're talking about 20 years, and Tom, my job as an entrepreneur in biotech is to shrink that time. But that was all made possible from AI. We're not an AI company. I'm not going to sit here and tell you we're an AI company, just like when we went from using, a stone, to write things to paper and pens. These are tools that we use, exactly as Jeff had mentioned, to accelerate the development of drugs. And then on the data point of view, this is actually something I did underestimate. So obviously, since we're the first people to do this, we sequence every single patient's peripheral blood and tumors after treatment multiple times. And the amount of data that just comes from having 20 patients is more than 20 laptops, right? So you're thinking about the amounts of data that you're managing. And, for someone like me, I'm an immunologist that did old school, immunology, trial and error, and now we have all of this data, your head kind of pops off. And to give you an idea of just how powerful ChatGPT is, we took a paired biopsy and we just put the biopsy into it, the image, and just said, tell us what's going on. And it gave us a 5-page pathology report. We didn't give it anything else. We just said, this is a pre and post biopsy, and we just said it had been treated with an experimental drug. That was the cue we used. And it actually was very similar to actually having a pathologist read it. So again, these are just tools. And I think it's going to accelerate everything. Obviously, if I go to someone like Tom Cahill for investment and said, oh, here's what ChatGPT says, you should invest, he's probably not going to say yes. But I think AI is something that we have to embrace. And I think, AI will do one of two things. It's either going to make the haves in the world have more, and those that don't have less. Or my hope is it's going to bring healthcare and access around the globe closer together so we can be all closer and move our innovation faster forward.
I'm really curious to know what you think about the data. So did you say there were 20 patients in this
So we've
scenario?
actually dosed closer to 30 across the 2 programs.
So if you could expand that and share data with other companies doing similar things, what do you think could be done with this? What's the power behind all the data? So
I am a capitalist at heart, and so that data is very, very valuable. And if we were to work with companies that were like-minded, I think at the present time, Big Pharma is, probably 5 or 6 years behind where we are. So in the context of our data, it's very, very valuable. And so I think you raise a very good question of how do we get to a position, and I think this is where actually private-public partnership comes in. So we actually have a relationship with state government in Australia. So in Australia during COVID, they didn't have the ability to make RNA vaccines at all. And we're about enabling people. So the Australian federal government did a deal with Moderna to come in. The problem with doing deals with Moderna is Moderna wants you to use all of Moderna's technology. And so the state government in New South Wales said, we want our people in New South Wales to be able to innovate, learn, take control for themselves. And we said, look, we'll help you build all this technology. All we would like is to have 10% capacity of the facility to make our products for the region. And so through that partnership, we've actually given access, and we're helping build the local ecosystem. Obviously as Australia is a developed nation, so it's a little easier than some other areas in the world. But in the context of data, that's an area where it's beyond data. It's about training, it's about ecosystem building and giving power to the people. So if there is another epidemic, they're able to move a lot faster. And I truly believe that within the next decade, these gene editing technologies will cost $500, $600, $700 as opposed to $3 million. And so the more regions in the world that have access to these approaches, the more likely we're going to be able to really impact disease, moving into the next 50 years.
I mean, the pandemic is being used more than once today in my conversations with various health leaders. The CEO of AstraZeneca, for instance, this was a moment where we really saw public-private partnerships work because they had to. We saw academics, AstraZeneca worked with the University of Oxford, they worked with the UK government and so on. Do you think public-private partnerships are working as well as they did in a crisis?
Generally, no. I think it sometimes does take those crises. I think, one of the things that I was hoping we could learn from the pandemic was how we went about the process of both, just as an example, sharing information that allowed everyone to then figure out what they should target the mRNA against. Then the process of developing the vaccine and the first clinical trials to the pivotal one happened all within 12 months. If we went now to a regulator and said we want to go and test something in a first trial and then a second trial and do it all in 12 months, that isn't the framework that we're currently set up to do. And I think, Tom mentioned last time a risk framework for thinking about clinical trial conduct and allowing people. That's essentially if you think about what was happening during COVID, it was a risk-based assessment of how and when we allowed trials to sort of go and what speed, because we were thinking about the risk of losing millions and millions of lives around the world. I don't view it as any different. If you think about, there are somewhere in the order of about 6,000 rare genetic diseases, many of which patients don't have a treatment. I think maybe somewhere in the 300 or 400 of those have a treatment, so the vast majority of them don't. Many of them are diseases that cause dramatically shortened lifespan and certainly impacts their lives, even if it's not an impact on lifespan, it's an impact on health span, to Luke's point before. And I'd love to see the same urgency taken in the context of a treatment for those people, right? So I think it is the risk framework, I think, is important. So I think there's ways to look at that pandemic and say, what could we evolve and change about our regulatory framework?
Would you agree with that? Have we learned enough lessons? Has the pandemic changed us for the better?
Have we learnt? Do we remember? That's a great question. I think we don't have enough time for that. I think one of the important things to really remember, though, is we were all pulling in one direction. And I think part of the complexity, just as you pointed out, thousands of rare genetic disorders that all need different products with a whole different, standard there. And if you could build a platform for that, that would be great. But, in the context of obesity, hypertension, and we're at the World Government Summit where, obviously for governments, the focus is how do I get my average life expectancy to increase over time. I come from Australia where we have a public healthcare system, right? If you're on the either side of the bell curve, it is unfortunate because the way these systems are developed is to really drive, the general average up. And there are simpler ways, and I think Tom was getting at it, hypertension, obesity, cancer, autoimmune diseases. There are easier or lower hanging fruit to go after. The one thing that COVID showed us as a race is that if we actually get on the same page, put, the peripheral differences, we all want the same thing. Tom mentioned this, it's about our families and our future. If we come back to focusing on that and we just picked 10 global health options to tackle, I'm sure we could do it. But what's happened since COVID is we've all gone back into our holes, we've all gone back into our self-interest, and that's what's happened. I mean, I don't know how to solve for that. It's very altruistic for me to sit here and say that, but I too have my own self-interest. I have a company building therapeutics for cancers that express TROP2 and cancers that express GPC3, and I'm building RNA facilities. So outside of that, I'm not focused on it, right?
I mean, we all went back into our holes, but we do get these amazing opportunities like summits like this where we finally get to speak to policymakers. I think it's quite rare. I do a lot of tech conferences and it's often business to business, and we all complain about regulation and lack of policy or lack of incentives or lack of subsidies. From each of you, what would you want governments to do as a final thought?
Well, so I think if you take a step back and think about what could you envision as the future state of healthcare, I think of three main themes. I think of prevention and sort of more investment generally in prevention. Second is a clearer focus on mental health. And third is where prevention hasn't worked to avoid disease for somebody, which it's not going to. If you end up with a genetic disease, it's a result of, frankly, just a bad luck on the DNA draw, right? Or whether you end up with a cancer at some point, despite all your efforts to prevent. There is a need then, in my view, to evolve our system and focus as much as possible on curing those diseases, not ameliorating them, not giving chronic treatments for them, but focusing our efforts on trying to cure disease. So that would be the few cases that you'd interact with true, quote unquote, healthcare. The goal would be that you prevent the need to get into the healthcare system, and we focus on health as opposed to healthcare.
So more money on education, nutrition.
And just, yeah, and all the things that can come in the context of prevention, whether it's prevention of obesity, whether it's prevention of diabetes, whether it's prevention of hypertension, all of the things that relate to that. So that, then on the context of, in those cases where you actually have to treat, let's try to cure it. Let's not try to put a chronic treatment in place that you have to take for the rest of your life. And that will take new changes, new thinking in terms of policy. You asked the question of Luke before about the cost of a cure and the complexity of that from a business model. What we ended up doing when we launched our first treatment was proposing to actually get paid over time for it, despite the fact that it was a one-time treatment, and to actually get paid only if it worked. And so introduce the concept of paying for performance. So I think that we can't do that alone as a manufacturer. You have to do that together with government. We did a lot of work together in the United States with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Service on that concept. Any other healthcare system has a different structure, but I think working on concepts like pay for performance for healthcare systems that have less developed infrastructure, for example, I think it's a time to think about and plan ahead and say maybe we shouldn't try to build. If you envision that future I just said, the times when you actually interact in the healthcare system are when you really need the treatment and the cure. And if it's a one-time shot, you can bring a patient one time from somewhere in a country to that one place, treat them, and then send them back.
This is just what Luke was saying.
You do not have to build infrastructure in every single community. There's an analogy to the landline cell phone thing, right? Technology jumped over, and now you rethink how you build infrastructure. So I think there are things that can be done. And by the way, I'll talk a little more about this at my talk tomorrow, so as a plug for that. I'll touch on some of these other topics around genetic medicines. But I think that's the big themes: prevention, mental health, and then in the context of genetic-based therapies or curative therapies. It doesn't have to be genetic-based therapies. Think about how the system that you're building in a country can enable sort of catching and watching that trend.
I'm going to take a 60,000-foot view from there. I agree with everything that Jeff said. I mean, healthcare unites us all, and I think if we think about the geopolitical environment, you can have your opinions around it. It's certainly unstable, and I think from a global influence point of view, healthcare can actually bring us all together. And if you talked about policy. We're in a world where there are, economies that are really developing at a rapid, clip. And if you want to use South Africa is actually the primary example of the phones, right? There is no landline phones there. They all went straight to cell phones. And that all happened in the late 90s, early 2000s, right? So healthcare is just the same. So Western Australia is actually the largest healthcare system in the world by land, right? Not by people, right? And they're spending a fortune on how do they implement AI and tools like that to make it accessible, healthcare. And so I would think from a government point of view, the more interaction that, developed nations can have with those that are now faced with the challenges but have some resources that maybe they didn't have before to implement these things, we can help avoid making the mistakes of the past. We can look to make much, much more effective healthcare systems, and then hopefully, we can all exert, stronger influence and come around a common goal of humanity, which is again our healthcare, our families, and our futures. And that would be maybe a little bit too optimistic, but it's certainly outside of any of the other crazy.
I'd like to end on a little optimism.
We're entrepreneurs. We have the very nature have to be optimistic. So I think it's a nice way to end it.
Well, thank you for leaving us on a positive note. And thank you all for joining us for this track on health. I hope you've all learned as much as I have. And yes, go get your genome sequenced. Thank you very much.